So I spoke about community organizing as uh, acting for the common good through relationships and partnerships in a way that shares power. And for the rest of our time, I think if we could look at what sharing power looks like, that'd be that'd be really good. And that seems to me the thing that is most significant about taking community organizing approach. There's there's an odd kind of restraint to it, a distrust of heroic leadership. And that's often summarized in terms of the iron rule. And the iron rule, as many of you will know, is never do for anybody what they could do for themselves. And I haven't often experienced church leaders living that way, but I have tried my best to do it. For me, this comes from a theological conviction, because I think that's how God is. Somehow or other, when God created the world, although he is sovereign and able to do all things, he has chosen to step back and exercise restraint upon God's self, so that although God could decide every issue, God allows the random, the ungodly, and even the evil to have a place in God's world. We're not going to solve the theological questions that raises in our minds. I just note that it is odd that through church history, Christian leaders have often been, how can I put it? Have often been happier than God is to use compulsion and force. God seems to love to make us free. You know, I often think of Adam and Eve in the garden. Of course it's a poem. Of course it's, you know, if you'd set up a video camera, you wouldn't have seen exactly what the first chapters of Genesis say. But still, let's take that story where Adam and Eve say to God, okay, so we're thinking of having a fruit salad. What do you want us to put in it? And God's like, well, I mean, that's not the sort of decision I want to make, guys. I mean, what do you fancy? All the trees in the garden are yours, except one, which I've said that you may not eat of, but all the rest of them. I mean, do you fancy pineapple today? Have a pineapple. Do you fancy a mango? Have some mango. I've let you be free, and that's a trivial example. There are many much more significant examples where we might expect God to have a master plan, and God loves the fruit of freedom. God seems to give us creativity, which is weird because God is, after all, the creator. And yet, somehow, God pulls back. Or you might like to think of the example of Paul. Now, Paul, I think, was an awkward person. That's my picture of him. I think he's struggling in many ways. I don't think he always found it easy to get on with people. I think he was sometimes judgmental, and that was not for the good of the early church. And yet, Paul is always promoting people. If you look at the letters, very often the letters of Paul aren't from Paul. They're from Paul and Silas, or Paul and Timothy, or Paul and somebody else. Now we know that the main thought behind the letter was Paul's, and yet he always wanted to include someone else with him in the writing of them. I'm not saying I'm like the Apostle Paul at all in any way, but I never understood why I was the only vicar I knew whose general practice, not every week, but let's say most months, was to preach a sermon with someone else, usually someone who hadn't had much experience of speaking up front. I mean, I would do most of the work, but I would meet with them and get their views and listen to their stories and enable them to be part of the preaching process. We did that with a number of under 16s who have gone on to find that speaking in the public square was something that was quite normal for them. Perhaps in part because they were given that chance of team tag preaching at an early age. I mean, to be honest, where that comes from in my life is that happened to me when I was 14. I only became a Christian when I was 13, but within a year, a vicar of a church asked me if I would join him in preaching. And I know if Caroline Beckett, who many of you will know and is also very involved in community organising in the diocese we're here, she'd tell the same story, that actually she was in her mid-teens when somebody standing alongside her and making sure that they were supporting every step of the way, got her preaching at that age as well. It seems to me that ought to be a normal part of church life. And I think Paul did that quite a bit. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, this is an odd thing that he says. He's reminiscing and he says, "Now when I went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ and found that the Lord had opened a door for me, I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said goodbye to them and moved on." I mean, it can't surely have been that Paul didn't have the self-confidence to preach, especially because he says the Lord had opened a door for the gospel, but he seems on principle never to have preached on his own. And Titus, he'd hoped Titus was there. Titus wasn't there. So he's like, okay, so obviously I'm not going to preach here then. I'll go somewhere else where I can find someone else to do it with me. There is a sharing of power, I think, in the life of Paul that the church would do well to experience today. And it's not just about preaching, is it? It's about everything that we do in church life. Though I would say, if you can build those teams in the public areas of church life, especially in preaching and the leading of worship, in my experience, it then becomes easier to get volunteers to, I don't even like the word volunteers actually, but to get the people of God to share in the running of the church behind the scenes. You kind of have to model it up front, and then you'll see the fruit of it in terms of people being church wardens and treasurers and all the other things that we need teams to do. So this is a thing we did in Gallywood. We became aware that an awful lot of the people who were speaking up front had an accent a bit like mine. However, the area is largely 2 housing estates, and the accents spoken by the people who live in the parish are not like mine. So it became even more important at that point to actively look out for the people who had more sensitive accents, and do what we could to get them leading a service, speaking, whatever it might be, and then the various behind the scenes things. When I became vicar of Gallywood, there was this sense, this is back in 2005, that every area of church life had a specialist who led it. Very often the vicar was expected to lead every area of church life, but even if it wasn't the vicar, it would be one person. So there's a person in charge of music and everyone else was seen as helping them out, a sort of triangle structure. I really don't like triangles. I can't see a triangle without wanting to disrupt it and change it. Never invite me to an orchestral concert; it won't go well. So so the person in charge of children's work would have some helpers in a triangular structure, and the person in charge of youth work, and the treasurer, and so on. So the job quite quickly became disrupting those structures and creating flat teams instead, where power was genuinely shared, where nobody had power over, but lots of people had power with. I mean, after all, to refer to the Magnificat, if God is going to throw down the mighty from their thrones and lift up the humble and meek, he will presumably end up with all of us roughly at eye level with each other. And that's the aim that we have in all of this. So here's my 5-stage process for building teams in church life. Number 1, a vacancy for a responsible person would arise, either through one of the leaders resigning, and you always, you know the saying, don't you, in the Church of God, always accept a resignation, never accept a piano. Or the vacancy would arise from me stopping doing a thing, identifying a part of my job that I could fruitfully pass on, or frankly wasn't gifted for. There are many things that I am frankly not gifted for. Incompetence is a really useful thing for clergy to have, for church leaders to have in general. If you don't already have the talent of incompetence, you might have to pretend just a little bit. So that's stage 1, a vacancy arises. Stage 2, well, this is the stage of autocracy, where I used my own authority to redefine what the job entailed and make whatever decisions were urgent. And if possible, jot down in a few sentences exactly what the job is. Stage 3, to put together a flat team of equals to work with me to achieve whatever the goal of the team was. I made it clear at the very first meeting that it was not my normal policy to chair the team for more than a month. So the team would have to work out between them who the chair of the team was going to be and what style of leadership was going to operate. At this stage, I often found that the original leader of the ministry, the person who resigned, started to get interested that this team was forming, and found out that they wouldn't have to shoulder the whole burden on themselves if they did become part of it again, and they often rejoined the team as a team member, which usually worked fine. So I was there for 12 years, and I was able to see 5 individuals, and I could name them, at least I could at the point where I made these notes. 5 individuals moved from not being a follower of Jesus to joining the community of the church and making a commitment to follow Jesus, to becoming part of a flat team doing something in church life, to chairing one of those teams. I mean, that's the exciting thing. I mean, I know not everyone is 12 years in a place, and that was a luxury that I had, that I could see that development. But that's the exciting thing. Some of the people who in a few years' time will be leading the flat teams that run the church haven't become Christians yet. Fourth, a formal recognition of the new team. Sometimes that meant sort of the PCC recognizing it, or sometimes a public commissioning, something like that, so that people knew a new era is beginning. Fifth, and finally, of these 5 points, I withdrew from being part of that team. I mean, honestly, if you are going to be healthy in ministry, you can't be long-term part of many teams in church life. It just does your head in. You might have to be to turn a corner. And of course, I was always there and available, and I would sometimes turn up to the meetings. And certainly I would troubleshoot if needed, and people could refer to me. But mostly I just had one-to-ones with the team leaders and let them get on with running those teams in church life. And I think there were about 13 of those teams formed on that pattern, from a preacher's team and a service leaders team to a pastoral care team and a churchyard team, and various teams concerned with serving the community and listening to the community. Yeah, and then I left. By the time I'd been in Gallywood for 8 years, there was no area of church life that was running without a team to lead it. And there were over 120 people who were members of at least one team. And that's not bad, because the average adult attendance at that church was 110. In other words, we had more people in leadership positions than we had attending church. I'm a little bit of a heretic on this, because I don't think people have to come to church. You do. Sorry, you do. But I don't think the people of God have to be in church every Sunday, otherwise God will be cross with them. I think they need to be there enough to be fully a part of the community, and don't need to feel guilty if they're not there all the time, especially when they've got a responsibility for running a debt advice centre or something like that some of our teams did. By the time I left, I wasn't chairing any teams at all, except a 6-monthly review of mission. I hadn't chaired the PCC for a decade. And even the ministry leadership team, to which the pastoral care team and the preachers team and the service leaders team were accountable, was convened by an LLM. It's a real culture change. So let me tell a story that I'm really sorry. I think some of you have heard this one before. I'm trying not to repeat myself too much. But around the year 2008, we tried to bring about this kind of change as we were trying to set up a pastoral care team. I was having complaints from some of the elderly and housebound people that we visit, because when a couple of lay people from the pastoral care team dropped in, it felt as if the church hasn't been, by which they meant the clergy haven't been. And one elderly housebound church member died. And the son contacted me and said that in her whole last 6 months of life, the church hadn't visited her. And I said, oh, I am so sorry. I genuinely thought Edith and Elva were really regularly visiting. And he said, oh yeah, Edith and Elva were here all the time. I don't know what my mum would have done without Edith and Elva. You know, they took her to hospital, they did her shopping, they bought her the bread thing. What's the bread thing? Oh, yeah, they bought her. Yeah, they bought her the bread thing. You know, they did everything for her. Okay. So I understood that there needed to be a change in the community whereby the pastoral care team was seen as the church. So I let it be known that for a year, I would not visit anyone in their homes. And Stephanie, who was the curate at the time, made the same commitment. And we got it talked about, and we got it even into the local council ran a sort of parish magazine thing. It wasn't church run, but anyway, we got the story in there that we were going to be doing it. And pretty soon the rumor spread across the whole village that the vicar, maybe the curate, but I think they thought mainly the vicar, wasn't visiting people. And then came, I don't know what he does really. You know, he works on Sundays, but other than that, I don't know what, even on Sundays, I don't know if he does much. There's all sorts of people that do things there. It is my view that if you do not have the reputation for being lazy in Christian ministry, you're almost certainly doing too much. But of course, the other part of the rumor was, yeah, I mean, the vicar didn't do much, but you know, there's this team of people and they're really good. You just have to phone them and they'll help you out. There's loads of them and they're really, they're like, this is a thing I heard secondhand from a non-church going villager. They're like everybody's grannies, which is a bit tough on Richard, who is a member of that team, but you can see why the village thought of the pastoral care team like that. So once a year had passed, actually, Stephanie the curate and I started visiting people again, but we did it quite quietly, and we didn't make a public announcement. We were restarting it because the culture change that the community had needed had been performed. People understood that this wasn't a church where everything was done by vicars. Well, every situation is different, and I'm not at all saying that your situation will be like that. But there will be ways to live out the iron rule. There are things that only you can do. If you're a priest, only you and other members of clergy can celebrate communion. Only deacons and priests can baptize. Incumbents have a particular responsibility for setting the culture of a church. You cannot give up those things. But almost everything else, it's about sharing power. We don't want power over, we want power with. We want power with in a really radical way. We want to set people free and encourage them and train them. And that's what we long for. So I'm going to get you to talk to each other in pairs, and then we'll come back and share with each other what, if any of what we've said this evening, or that I've said this evening, has an impact on being a minister for you. Go for it, Danny.
Yeah, so it's you touched on this, Andy, as well, and you talked about the need to grow and nurture and develop before you change your role. So you've grown the team transforms into a mature team, and they're a performing team, all the team stages, and you've got this great dynamic working, and obviously you put a lot of time into that, and you understood the skills of the leader needed to do that, and you understood what that transition would look like with the team. One of my risks that I saw would happen is that where people don't have the knowledge that you have on how to do that, and it becomes, rather than a grow and nurture, develop and delegate, it becomes more of a dump and run. And actually what the leader does is says, that's got to be done, or I think that's got to be done. They just set up a team. They don't have any skills. They don't know how to grow the team. They don't know how to do it. And they just dump it on the team. And it doesn't happen, or it can be quite toxic, or it becomes destructive. So it's a difference between delegate with support, delegate effectively, grow and nurture a team, as opposed to dump and run on
really
a group.
Well expressed. I couldn't agree more. And you did. So at one point I had to fire the chair of one of these teams, who was a racist, and we could not have her in any leadership position in the church ever again. And I told her so. You sometimes, you can be hands off, but you can't be too hands off. You need to be aware, and you never know when something's going to turn toxic, and you have to step in and troubleshoot like that. Absolutely. Yeah. Other comments, things that maybe are dangers in this whole approach? Dawn.
Yeah, I was saying how sometimes you need the person with the authority to make a decision. It's good where everyone has a voice and brings, but I'm sure Eileen and I were saying we've sat in meetings where you just go round and round and round the same, and actually you need someone to say, now a decision is made. And I think the danger in the flat team is there isn't that person. Yeah,
very good. Yeah, others? Marianne?
I'm not sure if this is quite exactly the same as what we're talking about, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things in my non-church professional life in the NHS, where there are a lot of parallels. And one of the things that I've learned the hard way, having thought that I was working very much in this way for many years, is that I can't always give away or share nearly as much power as I think I am, or that I'd like to. And that whatever I think I'm doing, that's not always what other people hear. And I've quite often been surprised, for instance, when I thought I'd made it really clear over a sustained period of time that I wanted to hear other people's views, and I wanted to hear their disagreements and their, the richness of what they thought, to discover that people didn't feel that they could say things. And so I guess I've learned quite a lot about the limitations of power sharing, even when I want to.
Really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, and I think that is sort of some of the same themes as Gary and Dawn have brought up. Yeah, and Gary's idea, you can't dump and run, absolutely, and that those constant one-to-ones and support and so on is really important. But also with what Marianne says, you also can't assume that people are able to express, the fact that you are willing for anyone to express whatever they want to say in the leadership realm doesn't mean that they feel equally free. There's work constantly to be done on that. Eileen?
Yeah, I think that's interesting what you just said, Marianne, because I was thinking that in the situation that I find myself in, where there was a possibility, or there could be a partnership working with us and our church and another organization. And what I sort of saw happening was the not wanting to share power from the authority. And so hearing you say that is quite interesting, because it's making, and part of the reason for that being was of a previous situation that had happened, and they'd got burnt. So here was an opportunity, and they weren't going to take in case they got burnt again, because there'd been some miscommunications and things had broken down, etc., etc. So, but I think it's a real skill, because one of the things that you said around discernment, it's about what's happening in that moment in time, and it's always about referring to what God is telling us to do, rather than our own anxiety about whether something's going to break down. So it's a real skill, because I think everybody wants a bit of power. And, because everyone thinks that they're doing the right thing, and they may even feel that it's their little baby, their project, it's what they want to do. Everybody wants to feel that they're doing that. So I think it's a real skill to kind of be equal and measured in, how are we doing this? Is it for God? Who is it for? There's something about the language we might use in order to get people thinking that we're doing this together rather than for our own good. Because of course, everything we do is for the good of God. So I think it's something about creating a culture where everybody's joining in that culture rather than think they've all got to go off and do their own thing. So it's just made me think a bit more about how might you bring it into a discussion so that people do feel that they're sharing in one voice, one body, one foundation, one church, or even one understanding, one culture, whatever that project might be. But there's got to be a sort of, almost like a strap line, are we all signing up to this? We all have our different parts, but we all sign up to one, if you like, one voice or one body. It's in Christ at the end of the day. So it's just made me think, because I love the idea of going off into a partnership, but I'm always kind of excited about it and then think, hold on, you've got to think about, what if this doesn't work out? It sort of fits into what Gary was saying, and then you have to kind of leave it and then going to hold it. You have to really sort of think about it carefully. So interesting.
Thank you. Well, that takes it. Let's now talk a little bit about partnership and that sense of building partnerships and relationships for the common good, and suggesting that might be oddly the way that churches grow in a number of ways. Did anyone have any comments or experiences to share about that way of seeing the life of the church?
Hi, Andy. So as I came in on the challenge side, I feel I should balance the scales with the other side of it as well. I was just reflecting personally on some of the work we did with the Chelmsford Single Homeless Forum, which we then tried to set up the Families Forum as well, and things like that. And what we realised is the piece of work that I was commissioned with initially was to understand how the cathedral could fit in with the provision for homeless, rough sleeping issues within the Chelmsford area. And what we recognised was that we're not the competent people in many areas. In fact, in most of the areas we weren't, but what we were competent in was the Ministry of Reconciliation. And that is what we brought to the table. So it's about one of the things that I think I found, and I think the Cathedral family found as well, but approaching with a sense of searching for the humility in the approach to find out where is everybody else excellent at what they do, where is there a gap, and do we fit into that gap? And what we found was that what presented to us was that there was so many organisations working for rough sleeping and homeless communities, but they weren't coordinated, and often there's friction between them. Well, that just spoke to us, hugely around this Ministry of Reconciliation that we can bring and a different flavour to the discussion. So we helped with that with the council and ended up, I think Ivor might still be chairing it. We was rotating the chair. I'm not sure if Ivor still chairs the Single Persons Homeless Forum, but we was able to change the narrative, take the commercialism and competitive nature out of it, and focus on the heart of the issue, and that reconciling ministry, Christ's ministry that we brought to it, we felt was the gospel being lived out through God's people. Whether they called it the gospel or not, it was a different thing, but certainly it was the gospel being lived out. And so I feel that we had an influence, we had an impact. It was kingdom building, not empire building. The cathedral didn't get more donations, we didn't get more people attending, it wasn't that sort of thing, but there was a heart that was beating stronger and more powerfully in Chelmsford for that community than it was before.
Have others had an experience of partnership in that kind of way, or do you see the churches that you're in at the moment sort of forming those partnerships? Claire?
So no to the last question, but actually I was really excited by all of what was said today, like you probably could tell from my face, because actually that model is how I used to work in a corporate environment, have the culture of a corporate environment in terms of, you know, trying to deliver things, working with multiple teams who all had their speciality, and actually works really well. And it's something that really energizes me as a person. And to think, actually, could we do this in a church? And you're saying it can be done. I'm just like so excited. But coming back to what Gary was just Gary was saying, a lot of our decisions when we were trying to like, we want to do, this is our aim, we want to, you know, raise revenue by this or whatever. The question is always, do you build, buy or partner? And sometimes you do need to just build it by yourself, but actually quite often, especially now, partnership with someone and building together is the way forward. So there is a blueprint for this in business as well, which I thought was quite interesting.
Excellent. And just time for comments about this sort of refusing to be all competent and do everything that you could do. How do you find saying no? Or perhaps how do other leaders in the churches where you are working find saying no to the idea that they might bear all the load by themselves?
My experience so far, Andy, is that there is a humility in the church and in the leaders that really pull them away from saying that. And I know we had the discussion and where we are building, because coming out of lockdown, my incumbent started his job at the beginning of lockdown, straight in to his first incumbency role, 10 churches, rural ministry, lockdown. We're coming out of it, got a curate. We're both learning this together, really. And so at the moment, we're at the there's a bit of administrative management going on, a little bit of that. But one of the things, so what I see, in my background as well of working with executive boards, is that the best chief execs I would see were the ones that would say, we build the board to compensate for all my weaknesses. And there'd be a sense of humility on the board where they'd say, I have Ruth with me because Ruth's so good at this and I am really bad at that. And I have Mike because he is fantastic at this and I haven't got a clue about that. And there's that sense of commitment. And I do see that in the church, I must admit. So it fills me with great hope and joy experience so far.
Joe?
I think I kind of see some potential for that in village communities in some places, but sometimes I think it requires the church to realise that it doesn't have to do all the things or to do them separately, and set up things in parallel. Because I can see in some villages where, for example, there are quite thriving community associations that are doing things like running community coffee mornings or setting up, mother and toddler groups and all those kinds of things. And actually the church just needs to get on board with it rather than try and do something in parallel, and to realize that actually we don't have to and don't have the resources to do all those things single-handedly.
Absolutely. Yeah, Dawn, you were going to say something, I think.
I think my experience so far has been actually the complete opposite to Gary's. it not in the sense of it's not humility, but it's a humility that I need to take everything on. I'm the workhorse, and I need to say yes, 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 even if I can't do it, because this sense of that's me being a good servant. And actually, what I'm seeing is clergy just being broken because they've just got too much on, and it's a humility because they're willing to offer themselves, but they're not saying that's not the right fit for me, and let's see who else can do it.
Yeah. Marianne?
Kind of picking up partly on what Gary was saying and partly on what Dawn's just saying. I'm wondering about kind of combining what we're talking about with actually a recognition of where are the specific skills and gifts of the individual, and what might be the particular areas within which whoever it is, they happen to be the incumbent, but actually they're using their specific skills in the same way that anybody else would. And I was thinking about the church where I grew up, which was a somewhat unusual situation in that it was a fairly newly formed parish, and the person who was the vicar when I was growing up had come in when the congregation had only been in existence for about a year, so he was fairly formative with it. But there were two things he was particularly fantastic at. He was absolutely fantastic at having teams and not doing everything himself and not feeling the need to. And it was a church where the laity did all sorts of stuff. But he also had a really specific set of skills around counselling and pastoral care. And he used those to the maximum in the church. He built up counselling teams. He trained other people. And it wasn't just that he was training others. He was directly involved with it. He was working at a diocesan level with clergy who needed counselling support. And he did that over decades and decades. And we had healing services happening in the local GP surgery because of the partnerships that he had with the GPs. So I think that's a really interesting example of somebody who was both building teams and absolutely recognising what he wasn't good at. And, he would say, I'm useless at admin, in the same way that Gary is saying, the chief exec says, I have this person because, but sort of the corollary of that is, I'm the chief exec and these are the things that I am good at, and therefore I'm fulfilling my gifts just as everybody else is.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening.